Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's Grant Cameron, and I'm doing a update on the Stanton Friedman files. This will be episode 2. I have about 5 episodes done, and I'm going to try to keep them to about 20 minutes. As I pointed out about a month ago, I was at the archives where Stanton Friedman's files are housed. And I have been going through the 6,000 pages that I filmed there. And as I find interesting little things, I stick them in these little PowerPoint presentations. And so I've got a few interesting things today. And as I said, I'll try to keep it to about 20 minutes. It's been a little bit hard in terms of doing this because I've actually got a bunch of manuscripts that are in final stages of editing, and I also have some lectures that I have to do. So it's been a slow process in terms of going through all the 6,000 photographs. I have to flip them all, get them going in the right direction. I have to sort of do some changes to the photographs as I process them. And I have these these books that are coming shortly, the alien documents, which will be coming out very shortly. The Manifestation and Apports is a book which has been finished for quite a while, except for the final editing. The Mount Shasta book is basically ready, except for the cover. Contact Modalities, which talks about various types of being able to contact into what might be called the field or the Akashic record or whatever. There's a whole book on that. And then one on the Canadian government involvement with UFOs, which sort of in some ways deals with this material that Stanton Friedman collected. This is my little desk that was at the archives in New Brunswick, at the provincial archives. And I may have pointed this out before, but I like to point this out that the archives that's doing this is actually putting in a 6-figure investment into processing this collection. It's a very large collection. It's going to take a long time to put together. They have 3 full-time archivists. They have some interns working on this. This is a major investment these people have made, and the fact is that it's not the type of file that they would normally take or the collection they would normally take. So I always like to point out the fact that they have gone above and beyond to get this collection done. This is the head archivist who sort of negotiated to get the files. She spent a lot of time with Stanton before he passed away. They actually started to move the files to the archives before Stanton died in May of this year. This is Joanna, and she has spent many years working as an archivist and is the head archivist for this collection. She just told me this morning, which is she's watching a lot of the stuff I'm going to show you today. I post on my Presidential UFO Facebook site, and I actually post most days. I'll post 1 or 2 things that came out of the Stanton Friedman collection, because unlike a lot of the collections I've got, the Stanton Friedman collection is actually pretty interesting. And she's watching the comments that people are making, and she said to me this morning, I'm getting quite an education, and she has a little smiley face. I've done a lot of collections over the years. I've done most of the presidential libraries. I've done Senator Goldwater, Scott Jones, who was an advisor, Claiborne Pell. I've done James McDonald's collections, Phil Klass's collection. I've done piles and piles of different collections around the country. And the Stanton Friedman is probably the most interesting of all the ones I've been at. And the example I show is that I put a bunch of FOIAs in for the Clinton material, and I probably photographed 3,000-4,000 pages there out of the maybe 10,000 that they released. And I really haven't read any of it yet. It just wasn't very interesting when I was going through it. So the Stanton Friedman collection is actually very interesting, and you'll see a lot of very interesting things that pop up in his file. This is the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick. This is where the collection is housed, and it's on the east coast of Canada. A lot of it centers around these three guys. This is there's two main reasons I went to the archives. One was to get a file on the Cuban incident from 1967, which I will describe in, I think, maybe episode 5, it's in there, where I talk about the Cuban incident in 1967 that the NSA picked up, the communications of a scramble against a UFO entering Cuban airspace. But the main reason I wanted is Stan had worked on UFOs for 61 years. I worked on it for 44 years. And a lot of what happened, I was also involved with. So Stan, as you can see here, was with Jamie Chandray, who's in the middle, Bill Moore, who's on the left. And this went back to the 1980s. So a lot of what I have to do here for people when I do these presentations is to give you the background, because a lot of people weren't around in the 1980s. They don't realize what was going on in the 1980s, the very sort of dramatic, confrontational documents that were being leaked. And we actually have some material now that was just given to me by Giuliano Marinkovic that basically confirms a lot of the stuff that I was working on in the 1980s. And so that was one of the reasons I went. I wanted Stan's correspondence with these other two gentlemen in the photograph, and also looking for photographs and correspondence with what were called the Avery. Now we have Tom DeLong with what he calls his group, and sometimes it's called the Cosmic Club, up to 50 people that are sort of linked in and sitting on the sidelines advising or providing material. Bill Moore had 24 people that were government sources, people from the government that were feeding him material, and they were called the Avery. So I've followed the Avery for many years. I wrote my first book about them in 1990. And a lot of people now, because a lot of the Avery figures, these bird figures, they were given bird names in the 1980s, a lot of these figures have now re-emerged with the Tom DeLong operation. They're still there. And a lot of people have sort of gotten very religious about these guys now, and they realize these are key people and that they know stuff. And I always like to point out, I said that first in 1988, 1989, that these guys were there to watch, but everybody sort of ignored it, and everybody's sort of coming online. So a lot of what I will be showing is correspondence that related to what was going on back in 1980 when the Roswell crash story first became public, when the MJ-12 documents were leaked in 1984, and a number of stories related to the Avery. Now, I just did a radio interview with Jimmy Church and on Fade to Black, and it was 2.5 hours. And people might want to reference this, because in this broadcast, we actually go through a number of the documents that I had at that point, and Jimmy actually reads from some of these documents, some of the more interesting documents that I found. But you have to realize that I probably still have only read maybe 5% of what I've got. This is like a major collection, and it's very slow going. So I haven't really looked at a lot of the material yet. This is just what I've found so far. So you can go to Jimmy Church, Fade to Black for October 16th, and you will hear a 2.5-hour conversation about these documents. This is one of the documents, and there was a lot of these. I only photocopied or just filmed one page because it's basically the same thing on each one, and that is Stanton Friedman's itinerary. This sort of gives you an idea of how busy this man was. I mean, he was like literally flying in one airport and lecturing, and flying out and into another airport. And he would move around the country doing events all over the place. He was almost like, if you look at this itinerary, he was almost never home. And so you got to realize that he was doing lectures, which basically doesn't really allow you to do much research. And plus he was doing the research and collecting this collection that is 15 pallets and times 15. So 15 pallets and a computer collected with a bunch of files, which were just recovered a couple of days ago and have been moved to the archives. So a tremendous amount of material in light of the fact that he was traveling extensively. Now, there's a lot of articles that I will be showing as we go through all these episodes. And the reason I show them is not to give you any sort of like enlightenment about new UFO material. This just shows you articles in the past that Stanton was collecting that you probably have not seen before, that have been forgotten about. And it gives you some sort of insight as to what it was like in the 1980s and 70s and 90s to research. People think what happened today happened then, and I can absolutely guarantee you it was a completely different world. The thinking was completely different. The events that were happening were completely different. The beings, the intelligence were doing completely different things. It's a completely different world. So here's a couple of interesting articles that I'll start with here from Stanton Friedman's collection. And this talks about, now you have the New York Times has done their article, which basically says, you know, UFOs are real, the Navy's chasing these things around, and you look back, and this is an article from 1990, and you see very, very skeptical. This is the Los Angeles Times. UFOs don't even have a ghost of a chance of being real. And this was not sort of a slam article. This was an act. This guy actually believed this, and wrote this article about how could anybody ever possibly believe in UFOs and stuff. I think you sort of take your life in your hands if you've ever wrote an article like that now. I mean, people just simply do not have the skepticism that they had back in the 1990s. Then it was really cool to write articles. So this guy wrote this, and then he wrote a second article backing up the first article, and he talked about all the UFO believers who had sort of jumped on him, and how gullible these people could be, you know, to actually believe that this was real. And basically, his skeptical argument is, you know, UFOs, ETs can't be here because the distances are too far apart. And that's an argument that you almost never hear anybody say anymore. Everybody, even the skeptics, will realize that if they're coming across, they've found some sort of way to go through wormholes or portals to get here. I don't think anybody seriously believes that they're flying across these distances. But in the 1990s, that was the key article that this guy used to say, you don't even have to consider ET. It's impossible for them to get here. Now, the early years, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, deal with Bill Moore. Bill Moore is a key figure, and you'll hear me talk about him a lot in the lectures. He was the Tom DeLonge of the 1980s. He was in the top 3 most intelligent researchers I'd ever met. He was extremely smart. He was extremely good at what he did. And he became very famous, as I'll point out just in a second, for writing a book that went viral around the world. And he had a big connection with Stanton Friedman. And the book that he wrote was called The Roswell Incident. It was in 1980. This is actually when Stan moved. Stan used to live in California near Bill Moore. So they had a fair bit of contact. And then in 1980, Stan moved to Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, and Bill Moore stayed in Los Angeles. And so all of the correspondence, all the research that they had to do was done by snail mail. And that's something I have to point out to researchers of today, is that everybody does it, and it's sort of like you put up something on Facebook and you have, you know, within a day you may have 100 comments and people talking back and forth. In the days of research in the 1980s, you basically would put up a letter to somebody and sit there and wait for 2 weeks for the response. It was all done very, very slow. So all the correspondence on the major cases that were being done, say with Bill Moore and Stanton Friedman, were being done very, very slowly by either by phone or by snail mail. And before 1980, despite what anybody maybe sort of believes now, nobody had ever heard of Roswell. There was nothing. It was a story that happened in 1947. It had gotten front page coverage. It was discounted as a balloon. The story went away, and it was never, ever discussed again. The first time it really actually sort of came up was the 1978 MUFON conference in Dayton, Ohio, where Len Stringfield, who had all sorts of sources coming to him, 200 to 300 people coming to him and leaking him stories about alien autopsies and crashes. And I remember I was at that conference, he gave a lecture on crashed flying saucers and alien autopsies. He got a death threat. They had to move him to another hotel. It was very dramatic. It was the first time anybody had ever talked about crashes and bodies and stuff like that. And so then a year and a half later, Bill Moore comes out with his book called The Roswell Incident. And it was a major story. It sold a lot of copies. They made a lot of money on this book. And it was written with Charles Berlitz, who was the famous had the famous language company for learning languages. So Charles Berlitz was a very famous guy, and he had teamed up with Bill Moore to do this book. And it was at this point when suddenly everybody realized the Roswell incident may actually have taken place. Now, the reason it's called Roswell crash is because Bill Moore called it the Roswell incident. As everybody knows, the crash did not occur at Roswell. It occurred northwest of Roswell, maybe 70 miles away. So the reason it is called the Roswell incident because Bill Moore called it the Roswell incident in 1980. And this starts a whole different field of research. Bill Moore is contacted by a bunch of intelligence, government people, and a whole new world of UFO research begins. He was gathering all this material, and this is, again, background for people who really don't know what happened at that time. Bill Moore makes all these contacts, and through the different episodes, I'll bring up more and more of what happened back then. This is Bob Pratt, who actually I met in 1975. And 1976, he came here to Canada to do the Carmen, Manitoba story that really got me involved. And he was going to call it UFO Capital of the World. He was a reporter for the National Enquirer. And people always sort of talk about tabloids now and the UFOs being a tabloid story. UFOs have not been in a tabloid for probably 25, 30 years. And all the tabloids, as Bob pointed it out to me before he died, are all basically owned by the same guy. And the policy back in the 1970s was to do UFO stories. And this ended. They don't do UFO stories anymore. But Bob Pratt was the UFO investigator for the National Enquirer, and he was absolutely brilliant. He had unlimited amounts of money to go anywhere he wanted. I remember when he was here in Manitoba, he was flying out one day to Ontario and then back, and then he was flying to Wisconsin and back, and then he'd fly to Florida and back. And he was flying around all the time doing these stories and producing these transcripts of all the interviews and extensive stories, and it was really good. So Bill Moore had called him in to help. He was being inundated with all this information from these government sources and got Bob Pratt to write a book. The book was called The Aquarius Project. And I'm pretty sure I'm the first person to out this story. I talked to Bob Pratt because he was a friend of mine. And he said, well, we had all this stuff and we really couldn't prove any of this stuff. And this included MJ-12 and it included the Roswell and all these different stories that were being told to them by intelligence people. And he said, we really couldn't do anything with the stuff because we really couldn't prove any of this. So we said, what the heck, we'll just throw it into a fictional book. And this is a technique that's used by intelligence and it's used by movies. And that is you take a real story and you fictionalize it and you put it out that way because they couldn't prove it. But the book never did get published. It was sat on the shelf for about 4 years. And then in 1984, Jimmy Chandray, who was one of the partner of Bill Moore, got a film of the MJ-12 document in his mailbox in December of 1984. And once Bob Pratt saw that, he said to Bill Moore, okay, now you've got the document, let's go, let's do this book. And Bill Moore said, well, there's no company that's interested in doing it. So the book was dropped. And I have not read the manuscript, but there is actually a manuscript that already in 1980, 81, already had all the details of the story that would unfold over the next couple decades. So this is Bob Pratt. Here's the three figures, and one of the things I found very interesting, which I will discuss from time to time, is the fact that when the MJ-12 document, which is very, very controversial in the 1980s, and is now, looks like it's going to get some vindication and backup, was leaked to Jimmy Chandray in the middle. Stanton Friedman, as we pointed out, was now on the other side of the country. He was living on the East Coast in New Brunswick, and it appears that he really didn't see the MJ-12 document. There was, and I'll discuss this in a second, They were so concerned about this document and the document being sort of leaked, or the fact that people found out they had it. Stanton Friedman was working with them and they wouldn't show him the document. So they get the document in 1984 in December, and they don't release it until 1987. This is the front cover of the MJ12 document. My personal opinion is that the document is altered, it's fake, it is not real. It's almost like a recreation, or sort of a fictionalized version of the real document. So they leak that out, which gives them plausible deniability. They can say it's a hoax, but a lot of the material in the document is accurate. So that's how they get the material out and protect themselves against somebody being able to confirm that the story is true. It's this, my belief that there's this gradual disclosure going on. This I found, and a lot of people wouldn't really realize the importance of some of this part of this document. I knew from the investigation they were doing at the time that, and this is where people don't really realize what is involved in researching one of these documents. The word extraterrestrial appears in the MJ12 document, but you have to realize that in 1952, when they were looking to see in 52, was the word extraterrestrial even being used? Because you got to remember, the extraterrestrial alien story only started in 1947. Before that, there was no discussion about aliens or extraterrestrials like openly. And so they were looking, you'll see on a lot of these documents, they're circling, they're looking at various documents to see where did the word extraterrestrial come from? Do you use a hypothesis, or do you use a slash in the middle of it? Or a hyphen, and so they're doing all this kind of stuff. What this is, a book proposal, as I pointed out before, and I've actually got some of the figures later on in another presentation, where there's a lot of money made from the Roswell book, and this is a proposal that is by Bill Moore and Stanton Friedman, and they're going to do another book. So Stan is going to try to cash in on Bill Moore being very famous now, and they're going to do another book. So they have this book proposal. Now it doesn't go anywhere, and of course at that point Stan blames Bill Moore for a lot of this, which you'll see in a minute. Here again, you see they're looking at the word extraterrestrial. They're looking at you know, how is this word used, and this is sort of part of the proposal that they had made for this book. Now the CIA and extraterrestrials, if you know that Stanton Friedman had a lot of contact fighting with the CIA with documents and stuff like that. And so of course those were some of the documents I was looking for as well. Here's a document by Roscoe Hillenkotter that was in the Stanton Friedman's files. Again, here you're looking at the extraterrestrial word, which is different. It's got the hyphen in there, and they're looking at Hillenkotter. This is a document, I believe, from 1970, which he has put out here. And in this, Hillenkotter, who was his first CIA director, is basically was actually on the board of Nightcap, which was the first sort of real big UFO group. And he's basically sort of downplaying the fact that UFOs are extraterrestrial. He said neither the U.S. Air Force nor the Pentagon has issued any order suppressing the truth about UFOs. I have never heard of anyone who was in possession of UFO fragments, and as far as I know, no such UFO fragments exist. The conclusions as to the extraterrestrial origin of UFOs are, in my opinion, insufficient and unproven. I know of no prominent scientist or officer advocating the extraterrestrial origin of UFOs in public. So this is basically a letter. They're looking at the word extraterrestrial and this whole idea that you may have a guy who's sitting on the main board of the biggest UFO group who is there to push the story that this is not extraterrestrial, the UFO phenomenon. Now the Moore split takes place, and I really didn't know this until I saw the Stan file. This is one of the reasons I wanted to see. Had Stanton Friedman talked to any of the Avery figures? What was the background correspondence between these two? And that would give you indications of what was going on in behind the scenes, who they were talking to, and this sort of stuff. And there was a Moore split. I really didn't realize how bad it was, but it comes down to this letter that, or it's a sort of a note file that Stanton Friedman made. And I'll read a bit of this because it sort of details this. This is from 1989. And what happens is in 1989, Bill Moore goes and makes a speech at the MUFON conference in Las Vegas. I believe it was in July of 1989. The month after, all hell breaks loose because Bill Moore basically reads the speech. He does not give a speech. He reads the speech. It's organized. It appeared that it had been reviewed by the intelligence people that he was dealing with. He reads the speech and basically says all the stories that you people are believing are all, you guys are being taken for a ride. The underground base, it's all nonsense, it's all disinformation, and I should know because I was there. I was inside the government and I watched them do it. And so what happened was everybody turned around and said, well, Bill was inside the government and he was behind this disinformation thing, and he got blamed for the whole thing. So he was sort of telling people are getting used, and people blamed Bill Moore for that and continued to believe these bizarre stories about underground bases and shootouts and all this kind of stuff. So he makes this speech in July. and August, Stan writes this very sort of bitter memo. He says, it seems appropriate after the fiasco in Las Vegas, that was Moore's speech, to review my foolishness in trusting Bill Moore after more than a decade of interaction. This will be just a quick review. When Bill first approached me in 1977, he stressed our involvement in the UFO Research Institute in Pittsburgh. So he goes through all that, and basically what he points out here is that he was offered 10% royalties from Bill's book. He points out the fact that he was the one that discovered the three main witnesses of Roswell, and he provided this material to Bill Moore, which became the basis of the book. And in exchange, he was to get 10% of the royalties, and he was to get a 100-word acknowledgement in the book for the research he had done. And basically, he said, I did get my 10% of Bill's royalties. There was no acknowledgement. He wanted this 100-word acknowledgement. There was no follow-up book. And Berlitz was the language guy, the very famous guy, screwed up the book royalty, throwing in all kinds of garbage which didn't belong. I screamed mightily when I saw the galleys. So he was concerned that there was stuff in the book that shouldn't have been in the book, and that Berlitz, he didn't blame Bill Moore, he blamed Berlitz for this. He said, I trusted Bill to make sure the garbage in the book was taken out, that my acknowledgement was put in, and that my misquotation was corrected. Result, none were taken care of. I basically made enough to cover my expenses, but certainly not my time. And then he writes in capitals, misplaced trust. So a lot of this argument was about money. It really had, a lot of people will blame Bill Moore for facts, and very rarely did I see Stan really accusing Bill of making stuff up or getting the facts wrong. It all had to do with this money and stuff like that. And then he talks about Berlitz, fumed about my imagined slight to his daughter in New York. It was totally off the wall. And about my brief conversation with his agent. So Stan had phoned the agent and he was complaining bitterly about this book. And this was sort of held against him that he had gone after the agent. He said, I wrote a strong letter to Berlitz, which I showed to Bill first. I trusted his judgment and did not send it. Bad mistake. Bill was going to find a new publisher. Instead, I found Harper and Row in San Francisco and trusted Bill to work out the details. After all, he was the big author. Results, no contract. Misplaced trust. When I heard barely of the MJ-12 document, this is the important one. When I first heard about the MJ-12 document, I wanted a copy. So they got the document in December of 1984. And Stanton says, I wanted a copy, but accepted Bill's judgment that it was too risky. Because you got to remember, this was snail mail, that he would have had to send the document in the mail to Stanton Friedman on the other side of the country. And he said it was too risky. So it appears that Stan never saw the document, even though he ends up in the three-man team that puts the document out. and he has to defend this document, but he really didn't see the document. He later made claims about having done as much research with it as possible, which was nonsense and cost perhaps 2 years in getting to the bottom of it, and left us much more open to criticism than if he had given me a copy or had done the necessary document dog work. Misplaced trust. So he's saying the reason that this thing really didn't work out as well as it should is because Bill Moore between 1984 and 1987 didn't do the proper research, because he didn't have Stanton to help him, or Stanton to do the research. When Bill heard someone in Europe would be releasing the MJ12 stuff. Now this needs some background because a lot of people really don't know what this is about. Basically what happened is Bill Moore, they get the document in December of 1984, the MJ12 document. They find the Cutler-Twining memo, and they are working on this, and they're trying to verify the document. But in the spring of 1987, they're approached by the Falcon, and the Falcon was the key CIA guy who was advising Bill Moore, and he said to him, if you want credit for the document, you better get moving, because somebody in England is about to publish the document. The person who was about to publish it was Timothy Good. And what had happened is Timothy Good had been leaked a copy of the document as well. And I believe that was to force the document out, because Chandray and Moore were sitting on the document. So they went and leaked it in Great Britain. And then Bill Moore had to race to get the document out before Tim Good's book Above Top Secret appeared, in order to get credit for the document. So they raced to put out the document before they were actually ready to put out the document. And the other thing that Stan is mad about, he followed instructions from the Falcon as to how to put things out and to put out his gross focus issue. So Bill Moore had a magazine called Focus. So he says, he put this in the magazine with no explanation for the lines through the various words and security markings, and no explanation about the Office of Special Investigations telex. Now I'll leave the telex out for another presentation, but what happened was Bill took the document and he was trying to figure out where the document was coming from, how many people had gotten the document. So when he heard that it was going to be released in Great Britain, what he did is he put a copy of the MJ12 document into his Focus magazine. And what he did was he blacked out certain words in the document. And that was to tell people, and he made an announcement. He said, I want to know if anybody else has got it. If you do, fill in the words. So he wanted to see if someone else had been leaked the document. He heard it had gone to Great Britain. So, but he didn't explain why he was putting blacking all these words out in the document. And he took a lot of heat, even at that time, for altering the document. And the intention was to find out if anybody else could fill in the words. So Stan was very upset about this. Terrible judgment on Falcon's part and Bill's, misplaced trust. And then the really wild, some of the stuff was very funny back in the 1980s. There's a bunch of characters that are, today you have this, the skeptics today are very sort of, they don't have a sense of humor like they had in the 1980s. So here's, Bill asked me to speak at Mosley's California conference. Now, Mosley is Jim Mosley, who ran a magazine called Saucer Smear. And he was a really funny guy. I mean, he liked to crank up Stan and Bill Moore and Phil Klass. And he was like the National Enquirer. He would stir this up and get people fighting with each other. And he published cartoons in his magazine. And he was having fun with it. You could never really tell whether he believed it or didn't believe it. He just wanted to crank people up and have fun. So he runs this conference in California, and Stan gets invited to speak by Bill Moore. So he says, just after the MJ12 story. So the story comes out, he's given the lecture. He had put together too complicated a program, and had a young man selling a paying cocktail party for Friday night rather than having Stan speak. So Stan was upset that he didn't get to speak Friday night. Instead, they had this cocktail party. And then the thing that upset him the most was they had some young girl do a belly dance when they gave me the UFO Researcher of the Year award. So that was the kind of stuff that was going on in the 70s. And I was in the middle of this. I was in contact with all these researchers. and saw this, and that's why I was so interested in seeing the Stan's files to see what was going on in the background. This is a slide about Lee Graham, who was also involved here, and I will sort of end with the Lee Graham thing because I've already gone overtime here. Lee Graham, of the Avery, Lee Graham was known as the pigeon in the Avery. His role, he was a sort of a very religious guy working in the aerospace industry in the Los Angeles area near Bill Moore. Bill Moore would have a lot of interaction with him. And what Bill Moore was doing to Lee Graham is Lee Graham had a secret security clearance at the aerospace industry. He was working on satellites. And so Bill would give him the MJ-12 document. Then he would give him the Cutler Twining memo. He would give him all these different things that were top secret memos and stuff, but they weren't declassified. So of course it becomes a problem if you've got a classified memo in your possession that you stole or somebody leaked to you. So what he would do is he would give it to Lee Graham, and Lee Graham would take it to work. And if you work in a security environment where you've got a security clearance, if someone gives you a document that is classified and is not declassified, you have to report that to your supervisor. So they would give him the MJ-12 document, and he would take in the MJ-12 document, and he would immediately go to a supervisor and say, I'm turning this document in. My friend Bill Moore gave it to me. And of course, then they would have to investigate the document. And that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to force these reviews by the government and get feedback through Bill Moore's, or through Lee Graham's company as to, is this a legitimate document or is it not? Now, Lee Graham ended up losing his job over this whole thing. He was taking stuff in and causing a lot of trouble in work. But there is one incident which is very interesting that he actually filed. He claimed to me 5,000 Freedom of Information Act requests on the material that Bill Moore was leaking him. He believed that a lot of the stuff was legitimate. He actually files an FOIA to the Bush Library about the MJ-12 document, the Snowbird document, and all these different things that I'll maybe discuss at another point. But he filed it, and he immediately ended up with a visit from a general. It was General Kirby. And I believe this guy was a 2-star or 3-star general, shows up at his work site and has a discussion with Lee Graham. So Lee Graham not many people know who he is, but he was kind of a key figure. But he was a very religious guy. And when he got involved with this, it sort of became public, and he would tell everybody. He was not afraid to tell people what he believed and what he was doing. And he actually tells his minister, and which leads to this letter, which I found in the files. So the minister writes to him, and this Hyman's guy writes to him, and he says, "Dear Lee, I'm sorry to hear that you have apostatized from biblical Christianity into a UFO cult. I hope you will repent of the sin of intellectual pride and get back to church where you belong." So Lee, of course, defended himself as to why he was doing this, and all the documents he was getting and this sort of stuff, and he puts this back to the minister, and then the minister comes back again and sort of backs away a little bit, but still does not change his tune. He said, "Dear Lee, thank you for your good response to my letter. I am sorry I was a little bit harsh on you. I don't really know much about UFOs. Perhaps I am wrong, although I don't think I am, at least at this point. Pray for me. I am terribly busy with this church and work and other projects. I need your prayers in trying to win people to Christ." So I'll leave it at that. This is just sort of an example that you'll hear Tom DeLong complaining about this, the TTSA group, that the ATIP program was shut down in part by a group inside the CIA, which has been rumored about in the UFO community for quite a while, and that they shut down the ATIP program, saying that we're not going to allow the devil into the world, and that's what we're doing if we deal with UFOs. And so there are very strong people inside, this is, in churches, in the government, who do not see things the same way as maybe you and I do. And this is just an example of what Lee Graham was up against in the 1980s. He never backed off it, But as I'll point out later on, there was another researcher who was very famous for doing the big story that I did in the 1980s, and that's the discovery of Dr. Eric Walker, the former president of Penn State University. The guy who discovered him was a guy by the name of Bill Steinman. And Bill Steinman did at one point, he packed it in. He believed that he was going back to, he saw it from a biblical perspective and basically packed everything in. And he had done an immense amount of research and basically packed it in. So that's it for today, and we'll go on. We'll probably do a couple of these a week, and there's a lot of these episodes that'll be done. There's a lot of very interesting stuff in the Friedman collection. So I want to thank you for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.